Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles Stories of the Supernatural. And I hope you enjoy this new show, whether you're viewing it on the internet or listening to a podcast version of the episode. I do want to thank you for being part of my audience. You can also find links to videos or podcasts on miamighostchronicles.com, as well as where you can submit your story about any eerie experiences you've had, which I would love to hear about. Just go to the Submit Your Story tab. Please subscribe to our channel so that you receive notification of when we release a new show. And find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. This is where I usually live stream and where I give you a behind the scenes look at locations where new episodes are being filmed at. I also tell you about all the interesting guests that will be appearing soon on Stories of the Supernatural. I hope you enjoy the show, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles. How are you all doing today? I'm doing great. I'm doing fantastic. The reason I'm doing fantastic is because of the guest that I have today. And this gentleman's name is Mr. Paul Eno. As a matter of fact, I was just telling him right now before we started recording that I discovered him a few years ago, where he was already talking about the paranormal, different theories having to do with the paranormal or supernatural, etc. And believe me, one of the things I was fascinated back then when I discovered him, I want to say it was maybe 7 or 8 years ago, was that he made sense out of a subject that a lot of times some of the theories that are put out there are like, what? But anyway, not surprisingly, he's been called the most intelligent voice in paranormal research today and one of the most visionary philosophers of our time. He was one of the first paranormal investigators of the early 1970s, beginning while he was studying for the priesthood. His early mentors included parapsychology pioneer Dr. Louisa Rhine, Father John J. Nicola, who was a technical advisor for the film The Exorcist, and legendary first generation ghost hunters Ed and Lorraine Warren. Today, he's an internationally known broadcaster, an award winning New England journalist, a graduate of two seminaries, the author of 8 books, 3 of which are Amazon bestsellers, and he holds a rare PhD in philosophy. In 2005, Paul teamed up with his then 13-year-old son Ben to investigate cases starting with the Litchfield County Flap area and the haunted policeman of Vermont. And in 2008, the father son partnered in the paranormal, launched the radio show Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. And today, he still has a show Behind the Paranormal, which broadcasts weekly on WOON 1240 AM in the Providence, Boston corridor, and he streams live. Right now, he has an estimated global audience of 3 million. So, wow. So, how are you doing today, Paul?
Oh, better than nothing, Marlene. You've helped my ego, though, I must say. Thank you.
Is it? Well, you know what? That's what bios are for. I'm so thrilled to have you. And I usually ask most of my guests, did they have childhood experiences with the paranormal? Is that what got them interested? Was it as an adult? And there's mention here that you had contact with paranormal when you were in the seminary. Prior to that, as a child, did you ever have any experience?
Well, maybe through the back door, in a sense, Marlene. I had a very happy home until the age of 7, when I was witness to my father's suicide.
Oh my God.
Exactly. And, it was a very traumatic situation, to say the least.
Yes.
Wonderful man. And at the time, now the funny thing, I was the product of a mixed marriage. My father was garden variety Protestant. My mother was a very strict Roman Catholic. And my brother and my brother actually ended up a priest. And but the both of us, it was 16 years apart, were educated in Catholic schools that were very, very strict at the time, as you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
In those days, if you ate a hot dog on Friday, did this or that, or committed suicide, you went straight to hell.
Yes.
And here I was in second grade with the Sisters of Mercy. You can believe the name if you wish.
Oh, most
Some of
certainly,
them,
because I went through from first through eighth grade with the Irish Sisters of Mercy, so I know
there
exactly
you
what you're
go.
talking about.
So you know what I'm talking about? That they are either saints or potential axe murderers. So fortunately, I had one of the saints, Sister Mary Joel. I'll never forget it. She got me through this
Okay.
by saying essentially that she kind of put her voice in, God is kind of bigger than all that.
Okay.
But the question remained, where was my father? What happened to him? And that kind of stuck in my mind. And at the age of 14, when you could still do this, I entered the seminary. The minor seminaries are called in preparation for the priesthood.
Okay.
So I spent 8 years in the Roman Catholic seminaries, and then went into the Eastern Orthodox seminary, which was kind of traumatic because their priests are expected to be men. And that was kind of a new line for that, but that's a whole different story. But
Okay.
all through those periods, I was very interested in where is my father, and the doctrine that most readily suggested itself was that of purgatory.
Okay.
And anybody who has any smattering of Roman Catholic knowledge knows they don't talk about this much anymore. But if you were not quite bad enough to go to hell, not quite good enough to go to heaven, you would go to purgatory to be purged, hence the name, and then be good enough to go to heaven, and also to satisfy the Western craze for pigeonholing everything so we can understand it, even if
Mm-hmm.
we don't. So that was how I started. So in 1970, while a young seminary student, I kind of I should have kept more quiet about this because it got me in trouble. But some other seminary students and I found the so-called lost village of Pomfret, Connecticut, in the northeastern part, lovely northeastern part of Connecticut. And I had encountered an article in the Hartford Courant newspaper about this old man who'd go running around in there and take these pictures and look at all kinds of funny things coming out in them. He said he didn't necessarily believe in ghosts, but he was a historian, and so anyway, we hooked up with him, and that's how my first case began in 1970. Actually, going to the site in 71 and 72. So that was the origin of that.
Okay. Wow. And
However,
this was, and I want to point out for a lot of people because, especially, this was prior to the thing that came along with the Exorcist and all of this. This was before that took off as far as the interest.
oh yeah. Well, it was people were maybe interested in it. The Warrens were out there already, lecturing and stuff. But really, there was Hans Holzer and a few of the
Mm-hmm.
headliners. But there really wasn't. This was not the sort of thing you did on weekends. And people looked at me if I even told
Yes.
them, particularly if they were clergy and authority over me at the seminary. What do you think you're doing? You should have your nose in your books, and But I wasn't high up enough for them to pay much attention yet. So and the purgatory theory not only fell flat on day one, these people didn't seem to be dead at all, never mind in any kind of purgatory.
Okay.
So things happened that just totally rocked my world, as they say, and started to change my ideas. And it took at least a good 8 to 10 years before thinking clarified into what I think I know today. And I still could be wrong, but the old ideas just didn't seem good enough in the face of
Mm-hmm.
such physical phenomena as an ox cart driver, coming down the road. You could hear the hoof beats and the wooden wheels and the guy yelling, yeah, the crack of a whip.
Right.
Um, I mean, were these dead people or people just going? Was it time that we were dealing with?
All
And
right.
that was just the beginning. So ideas began to change immediately.
Right, and it's for some people, and it's really interesting because some people, when they come up against or they're exposed to these different ideas that challenge what they've been brought up in, especially if you're in a seminary, they do one of two things: they either forge ahead and kind of burn their bridges, or they retreat back into, no, I'll just not explore that because I don't know if I can handle the paradigm shift that what's coming with it. But it sounds like you said, I'm going forward with this.
Yeah, you might say that, and I'm still doing it. And then here it is, almost 50 years later. But that was. I didn't get in too much trouble. Actually, by the time I got into the quote unquote major seminary, which is the last 2 years of college, and then uh, where you had to, at the time, major in philosophy. This is at a different seminary. The faculty was really quite sympathetic to this. I was shocked. They
Oh,
had me working with the diocesan exorcist in Ogdensburg, New York area, all hush hush, of course, in the local state hospital, because things would happen. For example, obviously, if a person is diagnosed schizophrenic and you get things going on, but if things are happening across the room, things flying off shelves in the patient's room, things of that kind, obviously the patient is not bringing this about directly, or at least physically. So
wow.
that's when they would begin to wonder, gee, maybe there's something else going on here. And Father Cotter and I would kind of be there to maybe.
Well, I imagine
I never.
also
Yeah.
that they would be interested in like the confidentiality. Like, we can't explain this, but let's call some priest in just in case because.
Oh yeah. Well, he was the chaplain there anyway, and one of the
Okay.
reasons we were there, and of course the seminarians were engaged in pastoral work there anyway, ostensibly visiting patients and learning how to bedside manner and all that. But of course, I was there also assisting him. So a number of adventures occurred there.
And let me ask you, when you had exposure, like you said, to let's say that you were called in, do you think from what you saw, are we talking supernatural or are we talking somebody that's just their PK or their kinetic energy that's being put out? Or do you think it was sourced from some other place?
Well, these are all things that are possible, but the party line at the time from the church was that these were demons, okay,
Yeah. Okay.
i.e., servants of Satan who
Yes.
happen to agree with our theology, which I think is rather a stretch. Okay, like they're going to do what we tell them. When I got in there, I just and when I was working with the Warrens or anybody else, this was their line too. I think it still is. Lorraine is still with us, but very very elderly.
Mm-hmm.
However, that just again did not seem good enough. Just like it didn't seem good enough to think the guy driving the ox cart was dead and in some kind of purgatory.
Right.
Um, there were some really scary things that happened. I just got the impression that the person who was the possessed person, okay, and the official church ritual, you go in and you exert authority over this spirit, quote unquote, in the name of Christ, and sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't work. There
Okay.
was one, and I did not think this was a good idea, but I'm a 21-year-old seminary student, like they're going to listen to me. Um, it was we were in there, and there were the three exorcisms on the same person, 17-year-old girl who was just emaciated. It was awful, and I had to stand there with another attendant because she kept floating out of the chair. I had to keep pushing her back down.
She kept
Uh,
floating out of the chair?
yes,
Okay.
in the middle of the ritual. So obviously something is going on besides mental illness.
Shit.
You
Yeah.
can't have psychiatric situations intertwined with paranormal issues, which makes it very complicated. And I do not have a medical degree, as you said, it's in philosophy. But on the other hand, you're not blind either. I just got the
Mm-hmm.
impression the doctors just did not know what to do. There was always a doctor present at each of these rituals, but of course it's a very hush hush.
Yeah.
Only the bishop knew about it, and and that was it. So I just got the impression that these people had bonded voluntarily with another sort of life form
Okay.
that was a lot bigger than our narrow concepts had us believing.
Okay.
I came to the by the end of the decade, by the end of the 70s, it seemed clear to me that we were dealing not with demons in the classical sense, but with parasites,
Mm-hmm.
parasitical entities, life forms, creatures from nature, although very bizarre corners of nature,
Okay.
who came in from parallel worlds. Now, in the mid 70s, in total confusion, and I should say the late 70s, total confusion over what I was seeing, I encountered the idea of quantum mechanics. Now,
Okay.
physicists, many of whom I've talked to, will sometimes get frustrated with somebody like me with a degree in something else, taking this and then running with it. But I could never, I can't to this day think of any other explanation that's better than the
Okay.
idea that you have parallel, very physical worlds in most cases, where all possibilities exist, even if we don't experience them in our life, where Uncle Chuck never died, and where you can have intersects, overlaps, and overwashes, where Uncle Chuck is skipping down the street 3 years after his funeral here. You know,
Okay.
that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or where you have parasitical entities um, where that are feeding upon our essentially negative energy. I can't put any
Okay.
finger on it than that. And then this became sort of confirmed in the 1974 case in Bridgeport, Connecticut, with the Warrens and that poltergeist situation that William J. Hall wrote the very excellent book about it. You ought to have him on if you haven't already. The World's Most Haunted House. And he went
Okay.
in, he talked to me, all the surviving witnesses to what had to be the best documented and best witnessed poltergeist case probably in history, Bridgeport, Connecticut, 74. And I stood there with 3 police officers and 3 firefighters and watched a refrigerator, about 300 pounds worth of it, float off the kitchen floor. And this happened
What?
on several occasions. And how could this happen? What was an
Exactly.
entity do? Was this a demon? Of course, to the Warrens, this is a demon. And we sat around for 3 days waiting for the Bishop of Bridgeport to give permission for an exorcism. Now, other denominations, or particularly the Orthodox Christians, or the Jewish faith, or the
Mm-hmm.
Muslim, they don't have this institutionalized kind of thing where you have to sit around and wait for a bishop. So it's a little easier with them. But
Right.
in any case, I just got the impression this is not what was really going on. There were 4 entities in this house.
Okay.
I had physical encounter on one, trying to protect the little girl, on the second night of the case, Monday night on November 25th, 1974. And again, none of this matched the old ideas about what this was. And I really got the impression that this is definitely something else, some other part of nature, undiscovered science,
Okay.
parasites,
All right.
very smart, quickly learning entities,
Mm-hmm.
hungry and hostile, and we are among their food sources.
What do you see? Historically, there's appears to be a correlation between poltergeist activity and adolescence. Did you find that there was something about adolescence because of maybe extra energy that they put out, or did you come across other cases where it didn't really matter the age of the person? And I understand perfectly well what you're describing there as some type of parasitic form, whatever type of label you want to put on it, but that ultimately it has a negative impact on the human being that it's using.
Well, kind of all of the above, Marlene, really, depending on every case is different. The other party line that I was dealing with at the time was that of parapsychology, because
Okay.
Dr. Louisa Rhine was the wife of Dr. J.B. Rhine, both brilliant psychologists who pioneered the science of parapsychology in the 20th century. And excuse me. And Louisa particularly was interested in ESP in children. She did a lot of research on that. And she wasn't too interested in my poltergeist theory, but she was very, very interested in other possibilities than spirits, for these things. So, in the case of the Bridgeport house, you had what appeared to be a classic parapsychological situation where a young girl, in this case Marcy, age 10, had been confined to the house by overprotective parents, and she'd been in there for 6 weeks, hadn't even been out the door. And this is a little tiny house, because she'd been bullied in today's terms, we would say bullied at school,
Right.
physically injured, as a matter of fact. So here you have the perfect stage for the classic idea of someone putting out a lot of energy,
Mm-hmm.
entering the pubescent stage of life, and producing what essentially a Tibetan Buddhist might say a thought form, or a tulpa or
Right. A
something,
tulpa, yes.
and out you get this activity, or maybe even something that's not recognizable as an entity, but is doing this activity. Okay, I didn't believe that either, any more than I believed the demon theory, because it wasn't good enough. I got the very strong impression there were 4 creatures,
Okay.
entities in this house,
Okay.
and that they were. And I always find that these parasites will concentrate usually on one person at a time, even if they're working in packs, farming, for lack of a better term, a family. They
Mm-hmm.
seem to concentrate on one person at a time.
Yes.
Uh, we've had situations where it's concentrated on the woman. I'm thinking of a Burrillville, Rhode Island case in from 1998 up until recently. Ben and I work on cases for years. We don't just swoop in with stuff. We follow up, even if it's far away.
Okay.
So in this case, there was a woman who was the target. When we sort of trained her to cut off the food supply, and Ben and I joke that we use the Peter Pan theory:
Mm,
think happy thoughts, come together with your loved ones. It's very simple, really.
right.
Bring in humor in your family,
Yes.
as long as it's positive. Don't laugh at each other, but that sort of thing. Keep it positive.
Mm-hmm.
Faith, anything, love especially, and come together, and that turns off the food supply. And this thing got so frustrated in this house in Rhode Island, they could literally hear it pacing up and down the hallway at night.
Wow.
And then it went after the daughter. So then we had to go help the daughter, learn to do this. And she was pretty good at it because she'd been involved in the whole thing. We don't keep the children out of this.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that you've got a lot more to it than just someone who's approaching an age where they're putting out a lot of energy. I think that it's in a negative situation such as the Bridgeport house, will ring the dinner bell, as it were, for these parasites. So I think that it's really six of one, half dozen of the other, and you have to deal with each case individually because you can't assume that the party line causes, whether demons or some kind of parapsychological mechanics here,
Okay.
are at work in any case.
Let me ask you something. In obviously, since you've been involved in so many of these cases, do you see a pattern where there's some type of crisis, whether it's emotional trauma or something in the family to an individual that precedes, in other words, opens the door for this to happen?
Very often, yes. There are every family has stress. Every family has things that happen. You try and roll with it, but
Mm-hmm.
some are more so than others. Um, but I think that there's more than, I mean, financial stresses, marital stresses. I very often find that the kids don't talk to the parents,
Right.
and maybe one of the kids is involved with something really negative, some really negative occult thing. You find that all the
Mm-hmm.
time. Parents don't know about it or do know about it and can't or won't do anything about it. They're all, as I say, it's very, very case by case in this sense.
Sure.
But yes, you do find negative situations. You do find people separated from each other, and these parasites seem to thrive on division.
Yes.
And it sounds hokey or corny, but this really seems to be as real as it gets. And one wonders, not only in families or in people's lives, one wonders what influences do these parasites have in the public forum.
Yes.
I mean, not to get nuts here, but I mean, think of the nourishment they could
Mm-hmm.
attain through war,
Yes.
through the politics of America today.
Right. If that's if
I mean,
exactly if
forget
that's
the
what they
Russians.
feed off of,
Yeah, the
um,
parasites want to divide us. I don't know, maybe the Russians are doing it. I don't know, but who knows? I mean, not to get into that, but I mean, this division
sure.
is just killing us. It kills families. It kills.
Yes.
So I mean, good grief. So
I
I
mean,
mean, yeah, this can reach to all sorts of levels.
well, and I'm sure you've come across. I mean, families. Nobody leads perfect lives. Everybody
No,
has things that go wrong. It happens. But I don't know if you've
sure.
ever seen. There's some families where you go back even generations and you see like I want to use this word lightly, but it's appropriate. Almost like curse. Like the 80% of their lives are very negative with just, and it makes you wonder. Like, do you think that some of the influence of these type of let's call them creatures, for lack of a better word, even that it basically sticks to a family?
Oh yes, absolutely, Marlene. I've seen that. I'll give you an example. In I was giving a talk in California, in San Diego, some years ago, and there was a large audience, but there was one person who just sort of stood out in the sense that kept drawing my attention, and she was just sitting there, wasn't doing anything to draw my attention. Um, after the lecture, people came up, and she was one of them. And I said, "I didn't mean to keep looking at you, but there's something about you that drew my attention, and it's not necessarily good." She said, "Those parasites you were talking about, we've had some following my family for generations."
Okay.
And it was sometimes you find the kind of parasite that manifests depends on the ethnic background of the family.
Mm-hmm.
Irish people tend to see banshees.
Right.
If you've got a cultural continuum there, the parasites tie into that, and they will sometimes be what you expect them to be, so they can push buttons more.
Mm-hmm.
This particular family happened to be Italian American, and they had all had psychic abilities before that. And you find plenty of families with psychic abilities around the family, but they don't necessarily have parasites. But
Exactly.
this one did, and a long time to kind of maybe help her. And this is a long distance because I'm from New England, over the phone to kind of work out some of this. And there was a sort of melancholy in the whole family because of this long-standing situation. People kind of accepted it. But I
Okay.
do find that happens. And Marlene, another thing I should point out in parasite cases is it's not just the people; it's the site itself.
Yes.
Now, our very dear friend Shane Searway, who I know you're aware of, will say it's not people it's not places that are haunted; it's people. I
Mm-hmm.
think to some extent, he's right. But there are characteristics at a particular site that will exacerbate the situation.
Yes.
And oddly enough, years ago I'd go in. We had a larger team. I had a professor of electrical engineering from the University of Rhode Island, and I had a soil engineer and hydrologist would come in on cases. People say, "Oh, do you bring the local psychic?" No, I bring a hydrologist. I go, what? A physicist, and
Yes.
and then there's a place for everyone in this. But
Mm-hmm.
but these particular folks would find clay soils, sandy soils, high water tables, and unless the water is distilled, it will conduct electricity and electromagnetic fields, and therefore you have a higher chance of something going on. Because what did essentially Einstein say about gravitational electrical anomalies? They can bend space time. Maybe they allow for, at least in our scenario, they allow for what Native Americans would call thin places, places where the boundaries between parallel worlds are thinner, and there
Right.
can be overwashes and overlaps. And in speaking with shaman, I remember in just 1979 alone, I spoke with a shaman in Australia, Aboriginal elder, and one from the Cree Nation in Quebec. And they both told me the same, different ends of the planet, both told me the same thing. That, and I was lucky because they usually don't talk to outsiders, but they said, you're on the right track. This whole parallel worlds thing is essentially what we do. We'll couch it in other terms. We'll go into a parallel world where so and so does not have cancer because there are
Okay.
other versions of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Literally grab that and bring it back into our world, and all of a sudden the person's healed. So that doesn't always work that easily. But
Right.
that's in a nutshell essentially what we do. So hence the idea of the parallel world thing, parasites coming and going, UFOs coming in, and Mothman
Yes.
coming and going, people who are dead here but not there coming. So it really kind of opened up the whole possibility. So if that's the correct theory, um, it's either correct or I'm a self-satisfied idiot. I don't know, but I mean, it seems like
Because here, because I mean, there's the theories of different dimensions, but what you're talking also is in a way like a parallel to ours is what you're saying as far as people and places.
yeah, essentially yes. The thing that's awfully difficult to grasp sometimes is that there are so many of these parallel worlds. Now, people are maybe familiar with string theories. Okay, there are 11 dimensions. Well,
Mm-hmm.
dimensions are not the same thing as parallel worlds, strictly speaking.
Exactly.
In quantum mechanics, deepest, darkest quantum mechanics, there's the idea that all things that can be, will be, have been, are actually real in concrete form and all existing simultaneously. Because what did Albert Einstein do in 1952? Out comes the theory of relativity, his book Relativity, and he said essentially time doesn't really exist. It's a function of our consciousness. There is no past, there is no future. It's all simultaneous.
Right.
Now, given the fact that he thought quantum mechanics was he didn't disbelieve it, but he thought it was just too crazy. Einstein thought it was too crazy. However, he didn't disbelieve it. So you take that and then put it together with the idea that there are parallel worlds, infinite numbers of them, with many, many versions of ourselves
Right.
and of events. There are many worlds in which we've already died, and if we come close to them, and this is why I've often run into ghosts who think we're ghosts haunting them. They're
Right.
going about their daily lives, and because they see us as we see them. Why? Because you get this plasma charged boundary. Physicists call it a brain, BRANE, or a membrane, and you look across and you see this glowing thing. What else are you going to think? Oh, yeah, it's a spirit of some dead person. What else could it be? Because most of us have a very narrow paradigm that way. So
Sure.
these are all kind of new ways to look at it. It's not original with us. It's becoming very, very common in the paranormal community and the scientific end and the popular end too, to start looking at things a little bigger through this theory.
And what's really interesting, and I've noticed, even let's say with extraterrestrial life, that some people, there's always the thought they're coming from another planet versus they're coming from another dimension, or that's how they travel interdimensionally.
or both.
And of course,
Yeah,
that also explains in some cases the sightings of cryptids,
sure.
sometimes for a period of time and then it stops.
Yeah, that's true. This is what this theory does too. It gets into other areas of the paranormal because I began to notice in the 1980s that, gee, maybe I should look outside this particular house or this particular, quote unquote, haunted piece of woodland or something. And when you did look out there, you would find other things. I kept running into UFO sightings people
Ah,
would have.
yes.
And people say, okay, well, what's that got to do with ghosts? Well, they have everything to do with ghosts.
Yes.
First of all, we look at things in certain contexts. If you're sitting in your living room and this fluky little light goes flying, aha, a ghost. But if you're out in your yard or in a field and there's the same light with maybe a big ball of light over it or aha, an alien, and maybe it's neither, you know. Maybe it's something that we haven't encountered yet in our human experience, or at least not in the way that might explain it more fully. So yeah, so we're looking at we call it the pan paranormal phenomena, looking at all sorts of things. And so people of the caliber of Kathleen Marden from MUFON
Mm-hmm.
has been working with us for years now on crossover phenomena. She'll be investigating. She, of course, is the niece of Betty and Barney Hill.
Yes.
She's one of your fellow Floridians, too, and originally from New Hampshire. And we see her frequently, not as often as we'd like, but she works with us sometimes on these phenomena where she's had abduction research for MUFON. You
Okay.
want to abductees, and they've had this abduction experience, and this and that happen. Might be pleasant, might be not pleasant so much,
Mm-hmm.
but they'll have poltergeist stuff start taking place in their house. They'll see Aunt Gertrude come, running through the kitchen, and she's been dead for 20 years. This kind of thing, and things you can't even have names for yet that
Yes.
occur. And all these things, because why? In our theory, and Kathleen tends to agree with this, you live at an intersect area, a place where the membranes are thin, they
Mm-hmm.
overwash, they overlap, they intersect, and you will notice the inhabitant, even other versions of yourself. You don't believe some of the information we get at the show from listeners that say, "Gee, I walked into my kitchen and there I was sitting at the table."
Doppelganger
Yes,
kind of deal. Yeah.
doppelganger kind of thing. There are names in literature and science for some science for all this stuff, but we could be looking at a general theory of the paranormal that might get us farther toward understanding uh, some of the stuff that's even worse than the classical ideas.
Well, I mean, once I think you kind of wrap your head around that, it's just like your horizons like fall off the horizon. It's like what else is out there that
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, put it better. That's what happened to
and
me.
as humans, we're like, don't, I don't want to, don't, I can't handle that
Well, it took
because
10 years for this to happen to me because I was so pigheaded. Plus, I was up 7, I was in the seminary, and in 75, I switched to the Eastern Orthodox seminary. It just happened to be at the right level. I started studying for their priesthood, but then they had enough of me after 2 years because, what are you doing with the paranormal? You got better things to do. And
yeah.
so out I went with like a year to go before ordination. I was still dealing with the idea that I was supposed to find a wife. In the Roman Catholic seminary, no, no, no to that. The Orthodox just the opposite. They don't trust unmarried parish priests, which was a whole new song for me.
So,
I didn't even think of that. So I had all that going on, and then so I'm out on my ear in 1977. All my life I prepared for the priesthood. What do I do now? The
wow.
only other thing I could do was write. So I just, my dumb luck, I stumbled into there's one lonely newspaper in New England that would talk to me because I'd never studied journalism before, and I got my shoe in the door, and I realized why because the editor was named, his nickname was Terrible Ted, and he was like Perry White on steroids. 9 feet tall, white hair, yelled all the time in the newsroom. 8 months I was number 2 in seniority in the newsroom. So that's why I got in so easy. Nobody else would
It was
work
like,
there.
yeah, all right. Yeah, sure. You
But
sure you
I
want this
learned.
job? Okay.
And so paranormal research became part of journalism for me.
Wow.
So it has been ever since.
And
So
I
that
mean,
was the story of how that
well, no,
happened.
and it's like you said, I mean, I remember when I was a kid, it's like you said, about the only ones that had books out was Hans Holzer, and he would talk about all these revolutionary time mansions, and that was the extent of it. And then it kind of moved a little bit forward into the 70s and 80s as far as other shows and everything. But back then it was very people didn't really even talk about it that much, even if they were having their own experiences, because people would look at you like, "What's wrong with you? You saw what? You have this?" Or, God forbid, if you're having some type of what you described as somebody that's displaying, their either possession or something like that. That was a
Well, pity
difficult
my
thing.
poor wife, who was quite the lady, and in 37 years of marriage, she's come on one case, and she's very sensitive, but she blocks it. She doesn't want to deal with it, and she came on one case and swore she'd never do it again. So, but
Yeah.
she accepts all my
Well,
eccentricities,
well, that's what's necessary. Everybody,
and
you
our
allow that other
son too,
person to
of
do
course.
their thing,
Dan.
even if you're like, "Yeah, I'll just stay home. You come and tell me about it when you get home."
No, she
And
doesn't
it's
want to hear about it.
oh
So,
yeah, everybody's different, and that's fine. To me, it's like, I think the problem comes in when the other person doesn't is not on board with you and doesn't want you to participate or do anything with it, especially if it's a passion, which is what it sounds like
yeah,
that it is
there
for
are a lot of
you.
people, unfortunately, that has happened with.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
and we are not advocates for people to go out and do this.
No.
It's funny because down in your neck of the woods, I'm thinking of '04 when I was down at in Clearwater at that big hotel, the Bellevue
The
Biltmore.
Bellevue, yes. I got to go into the Bellevue
Yeah.
before they closed it up.
Oh, it's closed now.
The last time I checked, I've been checking up on it for the last, I want to say, three or
Oh,
4 years.
okay.
And they closed it up, and it's changed ownership various times as far as what they were going to do with it, because it's a huge property.
Oh, yeah. The
And the last
largest
I checked, like
wooden
maybe
building
less
in
than a
the
year
East.
ago, and another company had bought it, and they were going to basically renovate it and reopen it. And I haven't checked, but it's been closed for like 4 years.
Oh, okay. Well, in any case, it was supposed to be notoriously haunted, and there was a
Yes.
conference there in 2004 for beginning ghost hunters, and they flew me down to speak out against my better judgment because I'm sitting there and they go, Mister, what's your advice for beginning ghost hunters? And if you could sum it up, and I said, don't. You have no idea what you're doing, what you're touching, and where it's going to lead. And
Hmm.
230 people just sort of stared at me with their mouths open. But then I said, well, here we all are, so I suppose we might as well discuss it.
Yeah. It's,
And there were, a number of other people too, including Murray Silver from Savannah, who became a good friend. This is the first time I'd met him, and tends to agree with me. But again, people are going to do it, and they
hmm.
do it. And so people said, "You do it." So I said, "Well, I don't know. I kind of blundered into it. I mean, I had some training. I don't know if the theology was relevant or the philosophy and the mentoring. I don't know. There are no experts in this field. They're just people with interesting ideas. So people are going to do it. So maybe they should have the best resources they can.
Well, I think the problem sometimes comes in when people that go into it are thrill seekers versus somebody that's really truly interested in the phenomena.
Yes, very true.
So when you get a thrill seeker that doesn't get something, they try to do stupid stuff to get the thrill.
Yes.
And one of two things happen. Nothing
That's,
happens and they get disinterested, or then they get more than they bargained for.
oh, yes. Very
Yeah.
often, one or the other, sometimes the latter,
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
but
Absolutely.
also, as well as UFOs and things of this kind, we began running into Bigfoot and other cryptids. One of the wildest examples of this started in '05. As a matter of fact, it was my son's, and you brought it up at the beginning, the Litchfield, Connecticut Triangle case, as we call it,
Hmm.
a house in Torrington, an lovely old 1793 farmhouse, where six generations of the family had lived and still were living. I think that's kind of neat.
Yes.
And in the course of 10 years of investigating, really more than that now, of course, 13 years going on, it turns out that the homeowner was a cousin of ours, distant cousin,
Wow.
because the old Yankee families.
Hmm.
But she had lived there for 62 years when we started coming in on the case. And she had had a diary of all the
Yeah.
weird things that had happened over
Wow.
all those years. They included not only ghostly phenomena, but horses galloping up and down the hallways, strange boxy figures. I mean, things that don't even have names yet.
Right.
Kind of dancing by the windows. Very very tall robed figures Sometimes their heads sticking through the ceiling because they were so tall they couldn't fit in the rooms.
What?
Legs hanging. See, this is seen by the entire family. Legs hanging from the ceiling of the living room, walking as if on a surface that was not present in our world. I mean, you
Okay.
couldn't make this stuff up. Our first time there was on August 5th, 2005. And again, Ben was only 13. There were pictures of him, and he was a little kid. And we had our very first video camera. And he was using that. And I went out, and I it was outside on a stone wall by the driveway. Get a very old farm, it's a very rural area, and I could hear a horse galloping toward the wall.
Oh, wow.
And I couldn't see it. It went by. I could feel the wind from it,
Are you
the leaves on the
kidding? You
tree.
felt the actual wind? Like,
Yes, yeah,
wow.
almost like this Lost Village case from 1970 and 71. And all of a sudden, it galloped across the road and disappeared into what would be the woods. But again, I didn't see it. When you'd go into the house, the place, you're sitting at the dining room table, it seemed crowded. You could feel people walking around. And again, it's like all 6 generations of the family were still here, but there was nothing negative. And this gets back to one of our points earlier, Marlene. And if the people themselves are positive, negativity is kind of repelled.
Mm-hmm.
These people are absolutely lovely people, the family that had been there for so long.
Okay.
Excuse me. They had been very positive in the upbringing of their children, etc. And all this stuff is going on there. It was like a circus, but nothing negative seems to be able to get through. Now, if the Manson family moved in there, I mean,
Oh,
forget it.
wow. Yeah, I can imagine. And how
So you can
far
see how
back had the family been because it sounds almost like it's the place and they just happened to have built a house there.
well that's possible too. You have a high water table and all this sort of thing that does go along with it. It had been originally in 1793 a general store, so you
Oh,
can be in there and you can hear cloth unrolling like from a roller. Sometimes you can hear
really?
people talking as if the parallel world where that's still going on. Because remember,
Yeah.
everything's simultaneous in this theory, where it still is a general store is still happening. What all the horses are doing, I don't know. I mean, I think part of the building was a stable,
Well, yeah, well,
but
that's what I'm thinking. When you said general store, I was thinking, man, I wonder if they had like a stable that was
oh
part
yes,
of the
sure,
store or something on the
yeah.
outside or
And because most people don't have the sound of horses galloping down their hallways. That can be a little disconcerting if you're not used to it.
yeah.
But again, nothing overtly negative, but I think that it would be if the wrong people lived there.
Oh,
So
sure.
our case spread from there, and by 2005, we knew well enough to certainly to ask, okay, the neighbors are probably, if you can talk to the neighbors, they almost certainly have strange stuff going on too. And sure enough, there was the house right across the road and kind of down a little bit. This fellow was a big, tough Vietnam vet, wasn't afraid of anything, but he would not be in the house by himself. He and his wife would
Oh,
always go out together, or they'd be in the house together. Okay,
God, that's good.
and because a number of suicides had taken place there. This expanded to UFO sightings in this area by '08 and '09. People in Goshen, Connecticut, were getting out of their cars in this vicinity, watching strange lights go down behind Mohawk Mountain. We ourselves, Ben and I, saw these too. By '09, the military had shown up. Now, this is another layer of all this.
Okay.
These are what we call flap areas. Okay, now it's kind of arbitrary. They do seem to be in triangles, but they can embrace 220 to 250 square miles or more. And
Okay.
we're investigating 6 of them, different, well, including in Europe at this point. But the one in the Litchfield area, it was just typical because the military always shows up. Now, why would that be?
Hmm.
Now, in the case of Litchfield, that area, there were ground. They didn't care who knew it. There were ground troop movements, lots of air movements. People would be walking their dogs, say, to the edge of their own property, on like a farm, and armed people, at least who looked like troops. You never know. You don't know if this is the government
Yeah.
or not. Dressed in camo or in black, with M16s, would say, "Sir, you cannot walk in this direction, just please turn around and go back." Very firm but very courteous.
Wow.
Uh, Mark D'Antonio, distinguished astronomer who was a dear friend of ours and sometimes co-hosts our show, is and MUFON's director of photo and video analysis, lives in this area. And he said that he had strange experiences growing up, but that a good friend of his was fishing at a place he'd fished since he was a kid. All of a sudden, a Humvee pulls up. These armed guys get out and say, "So you can't fish here anymore." Like, period. Like, see you later.
Okay.
Off they go. This all seemed to be centered on we call it the funny farm. It's a farm with no farming, rather extensive, abuts
Mm-hmm.
land owned by the state of Connecticut, and we later found out is right across from a plot of land owned by the U.S. Army, which has a very funny windowless building on it with antenna and all kinds of wires that go over to the
Oh,
farm.
really?
I mean, how subtle can you get here?
Yeah.
Uh,
Uh-huh.
we were there in 2010 doing a pilot for a TV show. Every once in a while, we're approached by producers to do something, but then especially if it's on this area, something quashes it. All of a sudden, and we had Meryl Streep, who has a house in the area,
Okay.
involved in the latest one we did there, pilot, and she was in the sizzler reel and all this stuff. Excuse me. The wrong sizzler reel went out to the networks, who always come back and say we're too intelligent anyway, which I think is a mistake because people want more authenticity now. So whatever, we were down there doing this, and we got not only some interesting footage at that farm, we got a thing at the point three of the triangle. See, the house I first described is point one, the funny farm is point two, and
Okay.
point three we triangulated,
Uh-huh.
and is in a very strange kind of a swamp where a brook splits into two, goes around like an island with all these funny stones on it. And that's
Okay.
a place where Ben tends to have shamanic experiences. He doesn't like to talk about it. We
Okay.
collapsed, floated off the ground. This was on camera with this
What?
director producer from New York. And we have never been allowed to see that footage because somebody got in there and quashed the whole thing. Because Ben said they, meaning whoever's working at the funny farm, is looking in the wrong place for point three. He thought they were doing experiments with generating power by these membranes or
Right.
portals, if you want to use a traditional term. So we could talk all day and all night for a week about this stuff and not even scratch the surface. So this is our Litchfield Triangle case. And this is what happens when you start to look
I was gonna tell
outside.
you. I mean, when I see that, it almost makes me think that I'm gonna use the word portal because that's the closest thing I can think of as far as a
Yeah, most people do.
doorway or, I mean, a gateway, something where maybe for whatever reason that we don't understand, it's just either because it's naturally there or because whoever, whatever's in the other dimensions actually put it there. We don't know. But that's what it sounds like.
It does, and there may be more to it. We may be simplistic about it, but it does seem that wouldn't the government or industry even love to weaponize the paranormal, or at least find out where does Bigfoot come from or go? Where do the UFOs come from? Where do ghosts
Yes.
come from? Excuse me. And I think that this may be the reason why there's such secrecy
Yes.
down in the Pennsylvania Triangle, which we've been working on since 2016,
Mm-hmm.
a relatively new case for us. I myself had a Bigfoot experience.
You
So did
did?
Jane Sue.
What happened?
Yes.
What happened?
Okay. Well, sorry. The okay. Well, one of the things these people had read about the Litchfield case, and she said, "My gosh, these are the sorts of things that are happening around here.
Mm-hmm.
There are Bigfoot sightings in Litchfield area." So we went down there, and this is a farming area, rural, of course, but it's not wilderness by any means. There are, again, in the vicinity of west central Pennsylvania, Du Bois area, between there and Pittsburgh, and it's there are tracts of forest, but 10, 20 acres maybe, open farmland, this sort of thing. Where would a population of Bigfoot come from and go to? But everybody has seen it. We have had, and we're going back again. I don't want to say when because people are watching us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there are up to 20 families who will show up at neighborhood meetings we have there, and every single one of them has had Bigfoot and UFO experiences,
Wow.
sometimes ghostly experiences.
Wow.
July, Ben and I, and there was a little girl who had a horrific Bigfoot experience in the road, not a quarter mile from where we were sitting, was so terrified that she was crying. She wouldn't talk to us. Of course, I was who are these two weird guys from New England with beards. Maybe that was, but we hope that she'll talk to us next time. So what happened to me was this: September 16th, 2016. If people have good memories, it was a brilliant moonlit night here in the Northeast, a little chilly. And I had staked myself up in the upper field above our center of operations because we were
Mm-hmm.
only just beginning to expand the envelope on this case. And people, we had gotten some photographs of some very strange lights in the sky and on the ground in this field the previous May. So what we did, I was by myself. I had it was chilly, so I had the driver's side window on my truck was up, but the
Okay.
other window was down. Okay, and I'm looking for strange lights. I had the camera set up in the bed of the truck and all this. And all of a sudden, there was something weird going on to my left. I could hear snuffling, like under this old deer blind where it was all grown. I thought, oh, it was probably a bear because a lot of bear.
Right.
So something to my right grabs my attention, and in the brilliant moonlight, maybe 200 feet away, I see this big brown figure, the two legs moving up and down very deliberately, coming up towards the center of the field. Excuse me, getting over allergy attack.
I know
Um,
what that's like.
and so, and its head was down as if looking for something. I was utterly flabbergasted
I
because
can
after
imagine.
37 years, yeah, after almost 50 years of doing this, you think I'd know not to expect anything in particular, but not to be surprised.
Uh-huh.
And so naturally, I raised the infrared camera, shoot through the cold window. Naturally, there's no heat signature. So I went to get out of the truck, and all of a sudden, the phone rings.
Oh
It's
my
my wife.
God.
And Paul, why didn't you turn off the phone? I'm a little new to this Bigfoot stuff. Closest I ever came to divorce, Marlene, I'll tell you. And I said, I'm in the middle of a Bigfoot sighting. And she said, what? Who's going to call me in the middle of the night in the middle of a field in Pennsylvania, right? So by that time, it's long gone. And a few minutes later, I see these lights up in this tree. And I was and it didn't look particularly weird. It looked like a spotlight or flashlight. And the so I didn't want to take off across the field in the truck. I didn't know if there was something would
Right.
swallow the truck or what, holes or whatever. So the next night we had this neighborhood meeting, and I told this story. And then the next morning, because we were out in Shane Seaway, and I measured it, and we could see the track of something very large that had gotten up to that point. I'm sorry,
It's
and
okay.
had turned around and gone back. Probably when my wife called, and the ringtone, the theme from Lord of the Rings goes blasting out. So I told this story to the 20 families assembled. Hand went up, and it was a woman named Melissa who lived in a house on the other side of the field. Oh, see, those lights, that was my son and me. We'd gotten back from the store. We heard something big moving through that field at the same time I was seeing it, and they went up and tried to see it. And I said, why did you shine the lights up in the trees? He said, well, sometimes they're in the trees.
Oh.
They've all seen, and that particular house has shadow people problems as well.
Oh.
Yeah, and lights that appear over the house almost every night. So I mean, here we have our pan paranormal phenomena extraordinaire in our flap area. So that I have really gotten over that. And I always ask people, what did you feel when you were having this experience? There was that little girl who had the Bigfoot experience and was terrified. People sometimes usually have ghost experiences and are frightened or
Mm-hmm.
something that's not really good necessarily.
Right.
But I felt privileged. I felt completely at peace. And I wonder if it's because maybe we bring to the experience what we bring to the experience.
Sure.
Whenever I station myself in this, particularly in any kind of wilderness area, I always will express respect and love for the powers that be. And
Oh, I totally agree with what you're saying.
take respect. And maybe that's why I haven't had really such horrific experiences as many other people have, at least not since the 70s, you know?
Well, and I totally agree with what you're saying because people don't realize even when you're out there in the field researching something, sometimes things happen. Like what you said, you were sitting there obviously hoping to capture something, but in a way you really didn't expect it. So when you actually see it, you're like, uh,
Yeah, exactly. Again, it was not, and it was a wonderful experience.
yeah.
People would often say, well, the Bigfoot people, or they have a civilization of their own, they're not just animals. And now, having encountered what I believe was one of them, I believe that. I think that I don't know if they have some kind of sophisticated civilization, but they're certainly not a threat, at least not in that experience. And I think there's a lot that can be learned. Uh, down in that same night, as a matter of fact, down at another end of this area, Shane was in an RV, and he heard kind of this chattering outside all night long. Nothing had happened except later in toward the early hours of the morning. And the people at the neighborhood meeting said, "Oh, that's how they talk to each other." This kind of banter back and forth. But
Wow.
then later, way late at night, he happened to be near the property line of a clearing and a cornfield, and he said a pickup truck came down, and he went out to see what it was, and he wasn't. He had to walk across an area in order to see it, but two men. He said he couldn't really see it, but it had some kind of emblem on the side, and they were shining lights over in his direction. Now they happened to be stopping right in front of one of our trail cams. And
Oh.
the next morning, when the trail cams were looked at, the truck was not there. So how did that truck traverse that field, then might stop right in front of the darn camera, and it didn't pick it up? We're still
Yeah,
trying to
good
figure that out.
question.
You know?
Let me ask you, Paul, is that area anywhere close to Kecksburg?
It's somewhat north of Kecksburg, at least like almost 100 miles or so.
Uh-huh.
It's funny because the Kecksburg, I think we're kind of pushing the envelope out, and we might find that that's part of our area, you know. But again, it's arbitrary. You don't know whether UFO sighting or something is definitely attached to the same energies that are allowing the Bigfoot sighting 100 miles away, but it's a
Mm-hmm.
start.
Well, you know what? Because and it's and I really and you're absolutely right because I belong to MUFON and I also attend meetings here locally in Miami, where people they go in to see the a MUFON presentation and you know how everybody like gets together in a group and they talk afterwards and
Yeah,
I've had a lot of people that have come and talked to me and besides having some type of either sightings of UFOs, they also talk about things happening in their personal lives of you want to call it a paranormal nature of things that they feel or see. Like it's almost like they, there's some type of connection between one and the other. It's just not that
yeah,
they
it's true.
see a sighting of, let's say, a ship or lights. Something bleeds over.
Yeah, bleed over is a good term. That's why years and years and years now we've always asked, okay, you had this happen to you. Have you ever had anything else happen? Have you ever seen a UFO? We have a long questionnaire that brings in all these different phenomena, and more often than not, it will. And the statistics, as a matter of fact, we've shared with Kathy Martin because she's done involved in the experiencer survey for the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Foundation for research into extraterrestrial experiences. Um, she's a member of their advisory board, along with a whole bunch of PhDs. They look at experiencers, and now they're asking, other things besides your UFO experience. Have you seen ghosts? Have you had things, as much as we've talked about today, Marlene? So this is becoming mainstream now.
Right. But I know there's still a lot of people that think of extraterrestrial as strictly coming from outer space, if they even go that far.
Yeah,
Uh, the other ones that think the UFOs are maybe man-made, just that unidentified origins, but not necessarily out of this world. And then I think I've always believed that there is some type of theory that does exist that would account, when we're talking here, interdimensional. That doesn't
yeah,
necessarily, whether it's because of this is the best way to travel versus, distance linear, how we think about it, light years.
sure,
If we
yeah,
could, if the travel is interdimensional, they don't have to go through what we still haven't figured out, which is
yeah. Well,
how,
maybe we are figuring it out because I remember, when I was in the military, I had a clearance, not a very high one,
mm-hmm,
but you do find out that the technology that the government has is at least 10 years ahead of what the rank and file people know about.
sure, I believe
You
that.
know,
I believe
so
that.
and they're not in these. Yeah, I mean they're in these flap areas for a reason, researching this stuff. So who knows where they've gotten? It's you get different stories,
Well,
um, but it's true. I mean, how? I suppose if you're looking at the technology of this sort of thing, you could have, if you realize that you're already on another planet or orbiting another planet
mm-hmm,
for this purpose in some parallel world, just make the transition into that world where you already are, and there you are. You didn't even have to go anywhere, really.
Right.
You just go across the membrane.
Yeah.
Now, the trouble with that, and the physicists I've talked to who have mentioned this, you don't know what other things you're changing when you're doing that.
Right.
Okay, the whole time conundrum isn't valid. You go
Mm-hmm.
back and shoot your own grandfather, and then you're never born. That's not how it works. You just create another universe, another space time stream, if you will,
Right.
and the one in which you were born doesn't really change. Um, on the other hand, we're moving through these all the time. I mean, you can go nuts just thinking
Oh
about
yeah,
this stuff.
it's like infinite possibilities of almost what they call that butterfly effect, where that one
Yeah, yeah.
change basically creates a whole different outcome, for lack of a better word.
But even thinking about the technology is absolutely staggering.
I know
So
it's like, I mean, it could go in so many. Do you think that, let's say, for example, that triangle that you were talking about in Pennsylvania, do you think that's something that naturally occurs, or do you think that it's some part of our either government or science kind of experimenting and act, in other words, that we opened it up on our end versus it being the other way around? What do you
yeah.
think?
Well, again, it could be all of the above.
Yeah.
One of the things we're looking at right now is called the Bouguer anomaly.
Okay.
Okay, this is a gravitational anomaly that is well known to garden variety geologists who look for oil and gas deposits
Mm-hmm.
because they find that in the presence of the Bouguer anomaly, which is caused, they're not really entirely sure, but it's got something to do with the certain elements in the soil at certain depths. They'll be able to tell if there's oil and gas.
Okay.
Now, one of the byproducts of this is that the gravity is lighter in areas of the Bouguer anomaly, which is really fluky.
Really?
You assume that when you go toward the center of the Earth, you get heavier because of
Yes.
gravity,
Yes.
but that's not true in areas where the Bouguer anomaly is present. Uh, when you walk down a hill, like toward the river in the Bouguer anomaly area, you get a little bit lighter. Now, you probably won't notice this, but I
Right.
mean, it might be enough to do what Einstein said gravity does, and that's bend space and time, just enough to maybe open up some membranes. Okay. Now,
Mm-hmm.
where is this Bouguer anomaly present? The most, the strongest by far Bouguer anomaly period phenomenon in Connecticut is where? Right smack in the middle of our Litchfield triangle. Goshen, Torrington, Litchfield, right there.
Wow.
See it on a map. The areas of the Pennsylvania Triangle we're investigating, north of Pittsburgh, down through the Ohio Valley, Mothman vicinity of West Virginia,
Right.
all the way down to the ones we're only just beginning, the Kentucky Panther Rock Triangle down in Kentucky,
Uh-huh.
all Bouguer anomaly, right in a straight line. It's called the Rome Trough to geologists, all the way down there. So is that a coincidence? Maybe
Doesn't
not.
sound like it.
The Lost Village case, 1970-72, we talked about in the beginning. Bouguer anomaly. Okay,
Wow.
so maybe it's nothing to do with it, but we're investigating it now, and it seems to have some promise.
Well, it's
Lighter gravity.
almost like, they try to explain it that the appearance of something being solid is only an appearance as far as how fast, the law of physics, and it makes you think, is it something where density is, if you're saying that there's actually less weight, is it, are we talking less density as far as everything that's shifting around that appears solid is not really as solid as it looks? I mean, it could
Well,
be like,
I don't know if I'd go that far. It's just essentially gravity is a little less. It's like if you go to the moon,
so it's the
gravity is
actual
more.
gravity part, not the
The actual
heaviness
gravity,
of
yeah.
the, okay, 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 I
Presumably
understand
the
now. I
yeah the
understand now.
gravitons presumably would be less. But and again, it's other characteristics of Bouguer anomaly areas are a lot of radon gas, and you can develop an immunity to almost any poison if you take it long enough in small doses, including radon gas.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people in say the Point Pleasant, West Virginia area are really almost immune to radon gas poisoning. All right,
Wow.
which of course is a carcinogen. And of course, some of these gases have hallucinogenic properties as well. So this gets into what are they seeing, why are they seeing it, and when are they seeing it, and everybody's seeing it. In the case of Mothman, hundreds and hundreds of witnesses, and
Right.
creatures, in my opinion. But you wonder what other factors there were as well, whether boozer anomaly or hallucinogenic gases or whatever. I mean, we're still working on this.
Well, as far as the hallucinogenic properties, normally when people hallucinate, they have their own personal hallucination. But if you've got people across
Right.
the area hallucinating the same version of something, it's like,
Yeah.
okay, why is everybody hallucinating the same version of whatever it is that doesn't exist supposedly or is made up?
Yeah.
That I had not heard of that bougie anomaly. That is so interesting. And like you said, and it's concentrated in a certain area. Wow.
Well, that's it, and it's known all over the globe, but it's in certain areas. So far, we've found parallels between it and paranormal flap areas. So again, this we're only just starting on this, and maybe it's nothing, but it
Sure.
sure doesn't seem like it's nothing.
Well, if you're telling me that you've got what looks like some type of military and government there, they're just not there for nothing. I don't
No, I
think
mean,
so.
again, wouldn't we love to find out how to use technologies to use these quote unquote paranormal principles? How to
Sure.
travel between worlds or whatever. And again, where does Bigfoot come from and go? Wouldn't they love to know that?
Well,
Wouldn't we love to weaponize it?
of course, and it's like I remember one time I had a guest, this gentleman. He wrote a book. His many many years ago, back in the '90s, he was a border agent over there in Southern California in this stretch called the Otay Mountains, and he was describing how every once in a while they would have different people because this he said this was in the middle of the wilderness. This is like nothing, nobody living out there. And he says that when he was new, you get the bad shift, which is the nighttime, the night. And he says when you were out there, you didn't have any type of lights. You were supposed to work in the dark, kind of thing.
Hmm.
And just to be real concise, there was one time where they could sight through with heat. This is how they would look at the landscape. And it didn't happen to him, but it
Infrared, yeah.
happened to a couple of the other agents that they were there, and they had their superior tell them, "I want you to get in your truck and just drive." And they were like, "What?" And he says, "I want you to get in your truck and drive away now. Like, don't ask me why." Later on, it came out that supposedly this person, that I think it was an officer above them, had actually seen on the heat scope. He says there was something large, really large, very similar to what you would think of the dimensions of a Bigfoot. And this thing appeared to be stalking them. When an animal's hunting another,
Sure.
when they were out there, they couldn't see or hear anything. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, and they never got that explained. And they said that every once in a while they would come across groups of people who described something, and every once in a while they would have auditory phenomena, where they would hear something but they couldn't see anything.
This wasn't in. Oh, you're talking about. This is Texas. This is California, so not Texas,
Right,
right?
right. This is Southern California, the Otay Mountains.
I'm thinking of the Big Thicket area in
Right,
Texas.
and
Yeah.
and he says that that went on for years, and of course, especially like in the '90s and everything. This was like you don't talk about that. You know,
Right. Right. Yeah.
they
It's true.
just don't say any. No, of course, it did never get into any official report. And he says sometimes the word finally got out when somebody either retired or they were stationed somewhere else.
Yes.
That
Oh,
kind
I
of
know the
deal.
I know the pattern. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like okay, I don't
That's
want to kill
true.
my career and talk about
Well,
this because I don't know how to explain it. Because I
very
believe
true.
those two agents when they got back, they were like, What's going on? Why'd you just tell us to drive away? What? There was nothing out there.
Yeah.
And
I don't know, but
like, where'd it
yeah,
go? What happened to it?
I know exactly. One of the and of course, Bigfoot has been seen in Connecticut and even here in Rhode Island, which is like 48 miles long and 37 miles wide. I know some members of the National Guard who are on exercises in what we call the Great Swamp management area because a lot of Rhode Island is woods. I mean, there's Providence and Warwick, and that's where most of the population is concentrated around Narragansett Bay. But there are plenty of wilderness areas left in such a small state. And members of the National Guard have sworn to me that they've been within, you could hit Bigfoot with a snowball, down there in the Bigfoot in the Great Swamp Management Area,
Mm-hmm.
and the big river and Wood River management areas as well. We also live within 20 miles or so of the Bridgewater Triangle in
Okay.
Massachusetts. And Ben, you're among the people who probably heard him grow up on the air
Mm-hmm.
uh, for all those years. And the 2 years, almost 2 years ago now, how old am I? He got married, and he lives a little bit closer to the Triangle than I do. But we still get over there now and then, and Bigfoot is there as well. And there are things that don't have names, as I
Yes.
say, that we run into. In that Bridgewater Triangle area, we have um, things, I suppose. There are traditions of fairies and puckwudgies,
Yes.
as
I've
they
heard
were
of that.
called. And there is an Algonquian word, puckwudgeej, which essentially was the natives who used that language group. That is little people.
Mm-hmm.
And we were up there one time in our four-wheel drive, and we were at the head of the Coppicut Reservoir. And it was just a beautiful place, so we decided to get out and look at the water, and there was a little clearing in the woods. Immediately, we felt as though we were being watched. It was a
Okay.
very, very strong feeling. So I just began to shoot photos at random. And now, again, I did intelligence photography in the military, and I know what I'm looking at. And you have to be very careful in the woods on a sunny day with the interplay of light on the leaves and all this stuff. But what struck me about the two particular photographs was that their flesh tones in nature in our latitude here would be very unusual unless
Okay.
it's some kind of fungi, and these were not fungi. They looked like two small figures. Again, two different photographs. One looked like a face with almost like a monk-like cowl, and the other looked like a long uh, figure in a fur coat, very clear face, this sort of thing. And people like Jimmy Church have seen this and fell out of his chair like when we saw this. And again, we don't make any claims. We simply let people see what they
Right.
feel they see. And I mean, pareidolia aside and all this stuff, I mean, again, speaking as one who did all this photography professionally and in the military, it just strikes me as very, very strange. In the same way, over back in Connecticut in the Litchfield Triangle, that very week we were up there with the production crew when all this weird stuff happened. The little 4-year-old boy in the family had an invisible friend called Ashwar.
Okay.
I wonder where we came up with that name. And so he said, "Oh, she's out." I said, "Where is Ashwa right now?" And this is at night. It's November uh, of, uh, of 2010. This is November 2010. Freezing cold outside. You would never have made it, Marlene.
Okay.
And
Probably not.
I went out and I just pointed the infrared camera up into the tree. And 6 seconds. This video can be seen on our Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno Facebook page. It's the first
Okay.
video. And there's this thing that comes down out of the tree looking almost like a tadpole, and it comes down, and then a couple of frames in, the whole frame lights up and the thing is gone. And was this Ashwar? I mean, his invisible friend.
What?
And he said, this little kid said, "Oh, her people live in trees."
Oh.
So I assumed that it was spelled Ashwar. Well,
Right.
our intrepid friend, colleague Shane Searway happened to be doing some research on this in among Native American cultures in Central America and South America, and he ran into the term Ashwar, Achuar, which were the people or the spirits of the trees.
Are you kidding?
No,
What?
I don't kid. I'm too serious. But there
Oh,
you go. So this 4-year-old kid in Connecticut knows about Ashwar. That
right.
this
That's what I'm
cool
thinking.
spiritual,
What? Where's this little kid
you
gonna
know,
pick up that word from?
and we get a video of one apparently. And since that's been out, we've had other
Oh.
people contact us with photos and videos that have been come from security cameras, things of this kind, of very similar creatures and other creatures that aren't similar. So I think again, it's the tip of the iceberg here, what most of us are used to, and it's the first day of school.
Let me ask you, Paul, do you think something like that? I'm going to use that example you just gave this little boy that's already looks like it's something that was even witnessed or named by Native Americans. Do you think that we're talking here something like an elemental spirit, but that is part of our world? When I say our world, is like, or are we talking against something interdimensional? What do you think?
Well, I'll go you one better, Marlene. I
Okay.
think we're dealing with we use the term multiversal.
Mm-hmm.
all these worlds impinging upon one another. And we move through thousands, if not millions, of these worlds every day. It's just they're so similar, we don't really notice.
Okay.
When ours are impinged upon by something, that's when we start to get paranormal. Okay,
Okay.
so this little boy, how would he know this? Well, how would
No, that's
Mozart, at the age of
incredible.
4, be able to sit down and write brilliant piano concerti that he performed before the emperor and the pope and wowed Europe at the age of 4, 5, and 6 years old? So in a way, the little boy, whose name was Dale, was probably may have been in touch with other versions of him, because it's all us. These are not separate people. These versions of ourselves are where we know these things and where we are these things
We just have a hard time grasping that concept because
because
let's
of the way
face it,
we're
we are the
educated.
center of our universes and we think
Yeah,
that this is our only reality.
but I think children, before we get our educational mitts into them,
Mm-hmm.
know these things,
Yes.
just as our remote ancestors seem to know these things. Even our Western religions or Eastern religions, to some extent, have these archetypes buried in the depths of their doctrine,
Yes.
or belief or experience, spiritual experience, and it's largely lost to interpretation today, even though it's still there. So I think this stuff is all out there, and this little boy hadn't been contaminated yet, maybe, and was still in touch with other selves. And eventually, by now he's coming up on high school, and he's ready to graduate, and
Mm-hmm.
he's been pretty much indoctrinated with, you don't believe that stuff except when you're a little kid. When
Right.
in actuality, it's as real as it gets.
And let me ask him, Paul.
So,
I'm going to ask you because sometimes there's debate. Let's go with the claims of extraterrestrials. First of all, do you think there's more than one type? And secondly, do you think we're going to be at a disadvantage once if we ever have what they call that contact of the fourth type, which is face to face?
yeah,
Are we going to be on the
yeah.
short end of the stick?
Well, I don't know. One can argue that we usually are,
Yeah, well,
one way or the other. On the other hand, I'm always intrigued by how people use the term advanced. Okay,
okay.
we assume, because we live in a society that's drunk with technology,
Mm-hmm.
respect for, and we use the term advanced for people who have better gadgets than we have or better technology. Well, I don't think that's necessarily a good idea. I mean, who was the most advanced nation of the 1930s? Nazi Germany. How'd
Yeah.
that work out?
Yes.
I'd rather have a civilization that is advanced morally and spiritually, as opposed to one, or maybe there is one that's advanced technologically as well as the other two, but I'd rather have the other two first. So
Right.
that being said, it's difficult to say. Nothing in the paranormal is what it appears to be. Stanton Friedman, who honored us by writing the forward for our 2016 book that Ben and I wrote, the paranormal, everything you know is wrong, essentially says that, okay, you've got a civilization from another planet, and there's every reason to believe. I don't think anybody doesn't believe that there are civilizations out there. There have to be,
Right.
with hundreds of billions of stars and probably trillions of planets. A lot of which there are thousands of planets we know about, many of which are not that different from our own.
Right.
Uh, that there are other civilizations. But even if they could get here in the conventional sense, Stan says, why would they want to talk to us? I'm trying to think of the exact quote. We're a primitive species whose primary activity is tribal warfare. I
Yeah.
wouldn't want to talk to us either. So I think Stan has a point in that way. However, I think we have to consider life as we don't know it.
Exactly.
Because we're always, we're up on Mars a zillion bucks later, scratching around. I think we're finally realizing we have to dig beneath the surface, but we're still looking for life as we know it. What about life as we don't know
Exactly.
it? Life that's not based on carbon. Everybody used to laugh at that until the 1970s, when somebody discovered these volcanic vents on the bottom of the seas, because we hadn't generally been able to get down that deep before. And you've got totally unknown forms of life that are not dependent on the sun for their biology. They're
Mm-hmm.
dependent what to us are poisonous sulfuric gases and acids that come out of volcanic vents, kill us immediately. So all these new so there is an entirely different ecosystem we didn't know anything about, and we wouldn't look for. And then you've got multiversal ecosystems where the laws of physics are very different. And bingo, you've got all kinds of life like Ashwar
Well, no,
or
I mean, even if you go on the premise of an ever creative universe. In other words, ever expanding.
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
it's
And
like okay,
afraid of it. But will we be on the short end of the stick? Just in running around the multiverse, as and I kind of do. There are whole areas we haven't gotten into yet about that. But there, I think, are lots of neighbors, most of whom are probably indifferent or don't know about us any more than we do about them. Although we
mm-hmm,
do know about them, that's why we have paranormal experiences. We put our own labels on them. But there are parasites who are
yes,
negative and who are hostile. I think there are plenty of very positive ones as well. Among them, remember talking about the house in Connecticut where they had the very very tall beings who
yes,
uh, reached up through the ceiling, and didn't seem to be affected by the matter in this particular neighborhood. We call them the Clerics. That was Ben's term.
wow. And because of the
Very,
way
it's
they were
considered one of
dressed,
the most frightening
or
paranormal pictures because of the way they dress. Yeah,
okay,
and because of their quiet, gentle, and compassionate nature, and the fact that they, the ones who are aware of us, are willing to give us a hand because they don't like parasites either.
okay,
Um, so that's a very long story, but there's a picture. I think it's from Kenton, England, or one of the parish churches around there. And somebody just took a picture of the altar, and there's this really scary, very very tall figure. It's a classic. It was 1930s, and it has a mask over its face. It looks totally unnatural because it's like 9 or 10 feet tall, very thin,
mm-hmm.
and it's considered one of the scariest and most legitimate ghost pictures out there. Well, if I'm a hobbit, if that's not one of the clerics, okay, and we know some of them, and I think that this is where it gets really weird, and I'm going to sound pretty strange,
Yeah,
but they wear the masks over their faces when they pray, but they're
okay,
good people, okay, and they're not ghosts or spirits, they're people,
okay,
of a different species, but there they are. Uh, there are a number of others, of course. There's one we call the lion people. We've had personal encounters with them. And again, this is in the presence of multiple witnesses, so it's not just me being nuts or whatever, or maybe it's too much radon gas. I don't know, but these are all things that we record, and we don't often talk about. But I think that would we be at the short end of the stick with some? Yes, with some, no. I think the more aware we become of our whole selves, which
okay,
are sharing the identities of
hmm.
these beings in certain aspects of the multiverse, we are a cleric or a parasite
Yeah,
or
depending on how you
according
want to
to
look at it, yeah,
yeah, I mean, it's all one big us, really. It's the Gaia theory taken to its logical conclusion, and with all due respect to the founders of our country, with the notion of individualism, yeah, that's very important. But we have to realize too that we're all part of each other and of all this other stuff too, and we just, as I say, it's the first day of school.
yes, absolutely.
So there's
Not a
my
bad
degree of
thing though. It's
scholarship.
not a bad thing. I don't. I mean, I'm sure that there's moments like depending on what your experience is. In your case, let's say when you saw the Bigfoot, you were surprised, but you were like in awe because it's almost like this is what you hope that you're going to witness at some point in your life when you're doing work in this field.
Yeah,
And then
it
there's
was
other
always
people that
felt
just
right.
don't grasp it, and for them it's frightening.
Yeah. Well, we interviewed, I think his name is Langdon from the Killing Bigfoot series. And a lot of people, even when we heard, we suppress no opinions on our show. Everything, we're open to all discussion. But a lot of people wrote in, they were upset. Why are you having this guy on? It's because we want to hear what he has to say, you know? And we don't agree with going out and killing anything, never mind Bigfoot, because it's, especially having experienced this, this is after we had him on. But his idea was it's really just a mammal. It's very good at playing hide and seek, and if we can bag a specimen, which science can study it, which strikes me as extremely naive for one thing,
Right.
and extremely short-sighted and very very narrow interpretation as it is. So we had him on, and he didn't really encourage us by saying anything more than that. So I'm afraid that our interpretation was correct. But I mean, he has a right to his opinion.
Sure.
Maybe he's right. I don't believe that he is. And I don't think he's ever going to be successful because these are not your ordinary garden variety mammals who come and go in that
Exactly.
sense, as we've discussed. And plus, they deserve respect. So,
Right.
although hunters, I had a lot of context in sporting. Hunters do, they are people with respect. They're great. They're great forces for conservation of the environment,
Mm-hmm.
this sort of thing. So I mean, I get that, but I mean, something like Bigfoot or any of these, I just you have to eat, you hunt, but you're not going to eat Bigfoot certainly. So
Right,
have
exactly.
respect.
Right, and if this is the only way that you think you're going to get proof, I totally disagree with that. I totally
No,
disagree with that.
exactly. Me too.
And
Yeah,
especially, and I agree with you up to a certain point. If you want to apply the rules that, let's say, a hunter does, whether it's tracking them or all the things, I think up to a certain point you're going to get disappointed
I
because
agree. Yeah, yeah.
it just,
I respect hunters too because when you're out in a wilderness area, particularly the Bridgewater Triangle out there, where all these things have been seen, they see everything. So you talk to hunters and you talk to Native Americans if there are any who are indigenous to that area, because their traditions will tell you a lot of people don't even talk to them. That's a really bad mistake because their traditions sum up what's really going on, and the hunters see everything. So that way we were able to track down a weird phenomenon known as the coy dog. I know you have a lot of it in Florida too, where domestic dogs interbreed with coyotes and produce
okay.
these kind of goofy hybrids, which are
Hmm.
just dogs, but they can be pretty scary. So yeah,
Okay.
you can always learn from anybody.
Oh, sure. I mean, it. I'm. I guess it depends on how you want to look at it. A lot of people get scared because of when they realize how much we don't know versus what we know.
Yeah,
I
that
personally
is
think it's very
scary.
exciting.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's just it's an occasion for learning more and for pushing the envelope. You know, because it's just when you think you've heard everything, the next day comes along and what it's
Oh yeah,
it's
of
incredible.
course,
So
of
yeah.
course. That's why
So again, first day of school, I think.
it's like everything. I guess it's all in you. Absolutely, what you made a good point. Like why that little boy was able to see something that sounds like it could be either an interdimensional or an elemental, whatever. That even Native Americans had named. Why was he able to see it and maybe an adult? It was just because of the, how can I say, there was no disbelief in him.
That's right. He was open
He was
and he was
open.
pure. Yeah, open. And um, I'll give an example though of how we get older and how we might misinterpret things, or maybe I was misinterpreting. I don't know. But back at the dear old Ogdensburg State Hospital, when I was a seminary student, there was one particular hallway in this ward, and people didn't like to work there at night. It was considered to be kind of kind of strange and all sort of thing. And I happened to be making some pastoral visits in that ward one night, or actually one day, and I stretched it out to 3 days because I encountered a patient who said that she was a psychic medium, and that what was haunting the hallway was a man who had died there, who was and his wife was in there or would be, and he was waiting to quote take her home.
Wow.
you know. So I said, okay, that's the classic garden variety 19th century interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's correct. So the
Yes.
chapel also happened to be in that particular hallway. So I
Okay.
disappeared in there. And the staff said, well, he's a seminary student. I guess he's in the chapel. So, I should have been out with the patients, but they cut me some slack. So over a period of 3 days, I did something I don't like to do, but I've done it several times and had a lot of interesting experiences because and I don't like to talk about it because it sounds like I'm doing the medium thing and I'm not. I simply get into a meditative state
Okay.
in an area like this, and if I encounter a neighbor in the quiet, fine. And I didn't feel any parasites near you because you give them a wide berth.
Mm-hmm.
So what I encountered was a man waiting for his wife, but he was waiting for his wife across the St. Lawrence River at the railroad station at Prescott, Ontario, in a parallel reality that was very similar to ours, but where it was not considered unusual to talk to the neighbors. This is where I got the term neighbor because he referred to me
Okay.
as a neighbor. Okay, and he couldn't see me, but he's standing on the platform, which was there in our world too. I used to grab the train to go to Montreal all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and he said, "Yeah," but I noticed that the spatial relationship was very similar to where it was in our world, but the temporal relationship was not. He had been standing on this platform for what to us would have probably been years, because time was measured differently. And I didn't have a lot of
Okay.
time to get into some of this, but A few weeks later, this presence disappeared from this hallway. Okay,
Mhm.
and the medium patient was long gone; she'd been discharged. But you can see where, if you have a narrow interpretation, that's how she would have interpreted. What else
Sure.
could it be but the guy waiting for his wife? He's dead and she's about to die, and what else could it be? So again, broadening the concepts really opens up literally whole new worlds. So if my interpretation was correct, that's what happened.
Well, not too long ago, I interviewed this lady. She lives out in the suburbs of Chicago, and she has a paranormal group. But and her regular work, she's a nurse, a hospice nurse, and she's been doing it for many years. And she was telling me, she goes, Marlene, sometimes I have patients that I've tended them for years, and she says one of the things that I know that as far as that they're going to be dying soon is that they will start telling me or talking about seeing relatives or people that have passed on. Not about them, as in that they relate that they're seeing them. That's why she knows in some cases, since she's tended to them for, it wasn't like that she just came in this last week. When she says certain names, she knows that who that person is talking about sometimes is a deceased, maybe spouse or some other relative. And she says she's seen that very commonly where she says that's how she knows when some of these patients will be passing away very soon, where they
Yeah.
actually start seeing or like in talking, like if that person's there.
Oh, I'm not saying there are no visitation apparitions, things like this. I'm sure there are. I'm just saying in this particular case that this turned out to be really, really interesting. And if I was right, then didn't match the interpretation of what she was
Well,
saying.
it makes you
Um,
also think, Paul. Do you think that's also like just like when we're children, that this disbelief is suspended? Do you think also that when we're older, or maybe we're going in the direction of that we're going to leave this life or as we know it, that we also our ability to see things that have always been there, in other words, is heightened just like
yeah,
when we're a child?
funny you bring that up. I've been thinking about that lately as I approach 65, and um, it's almost as if you do kind of reverse, and you realize a lot of things you thought as a kid you were right, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and you've kind of gone around Robin Hood's barn, as we used to say in Connecticut, throughout your life in order just to get back to the same place. And you find too that even some of your attitudes and the way you look at things and the way you feel things are changing and getting in a way maybe simpler. And maybe that's
Yes.
just what happens at this age. I don't know, or maybe it's maybe you're more correct about that. So I don't know, but yeah, I think things do tend to simplify, and maybe you get, especially if you're in this field, maybe you get a little reverse education,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the prejudices that were put into us in the school system or something or whatever, if they
Yes.
were, are somewhat mitigated.
Yeah, I believe. It's almost like all those filters that we put up in our conscious mind as though that can't be real or I can't see that or that doesn't make sense. It just those filters fall away
Sure,
and we're able to
that's
see
true.
things that really have been there all along. But like you said, whether we're conditioned a certain way, life gets in the way. We're busy. When we're younger, we have children, we have a family, we have a job. God knows nowadays that if you don't multitask, what's wrong with you? Um, all those things stop people from, I think, being observant. Is the only thing I can think of.
I think that's true. Yeah, it's a forest for the trees kind of thing.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
you really see this in dealing with shamans, and who are not very common. And
Mm-hmm.
to be one, and you'll often run into people, especially online, who are say they're shamans, and they read a book by somebody else who thinks they're a shaman, or they've been to a few classes. That's not how it works. You have to walk the walk and live the life. And I'm very proud of Ben because he studied under a full-blooded Aztec shaman for several years, and he still would never claim to be one. Even
Exactly.
though he has shamanic things happen to him. But I think it's a matter of just you have to really with anything, but particularly with that in this field, you have to walk the walk and live the life, and not just talk the talk.
Absolutely. I agree. And I hate to say it. I love technology in the sense that it's made life easier for us as humans. But at the same time, it's also worked to our disadvantage because I think we've
Yes.
lost touch with, I'm going to go back to what I just said, observing things.
You're
because
right.
when
Right.
to observe something, you have to have be patient, have time. Sometimes that's what we lack of the most. Just sit there and observe something.
Well, we need silence.
Yes.
Uh, the basis of any spirituality, let alone anything that's going to make you aware of anything deeper than what you see at the end of your nose, has to do with silence. And a lot of us are afraid of silence. Even
Hmm.
in the '60s, everybody had their transistor radios, and
Yeah.
the first generation earbuds were in the ears, and nobody could hear anything, let alone each other. Couldn't even hear themselves. And
Yes.
to cultivate, I find that spiritually, that is the hardest thing for people to do. If you want to approach understanding any of this multiverse stuff, or to get any insights, you've got to learn to be silent. And that's when you begin to see
Yes.
the
Where
distractions are taken away.
I think I think that a lot of the material that our subconscious mind captures, it when well, like you said, when you quiet down, it actually comes through to the front where you recognize
Yes.
it. So, but anyway, Paul, thank you so much for joining me today. It has been wonderful, wonderful to talk to you. I could talk to you for
Very
hours.
enjoyable to talk to you.
I could talk to you for hours because all your theories, um, I think that, uh, especially when it comes to supernatural events, by this, whether it's extraterrestrials or ghosts or doppelganger, whatever, I think sometimes we've just been too constricted
No, I agree.
as
Yeah.
how we see it or how we wanted to explain it.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
it's
it's
like,
true. So it's
I
exciting times that we're
I
pushing the
have nothing
envelope.
against science about getting proof. I have no problem with that. I don't think you have to exclude one for the other. But sometimes if you can't get the proof that certain scientists say this is the only type of valid proof, then if you can't get this, then that doesn't exist or that's wrong. I don't
Yeah,
think that's accurate. That's doing a disservice to um, any type of explorers,
that's
whether we're
true. Well,
talking
science
about
has
actual
changed it too.
exploration or in theory.
Right, right.
So I love talking to you, and again I want to thank you so much for spending this time with me
Thank
this
you,
afternoon.
Marlene. It's a great
It
pleasure.
has been wonderful, and have a fantastic day.
Well, we'll hope for the best.
Likewise, thank you. Bye bye.
Okay. Bye bye.
Oh my God, guys. Oh wow, it has been a great talking to Paul. Has been great. First of all, I'm not kidding. Uh, I discovered Paul Eno. I want to say, oh no, it has to be earlier than that. Oh 07, oh 08, and back then I was always looking for either podcasts or people that would talk about the paranormal, and that basically that they had they had new theories or just they just sounded reasonable. That and I would listen to him and I remember like he said his son was young. I think he was a teenager at that time when he brought him on. And I remember listening to his theories of how he explained what some people consider ghostly was basically almost like a bleed over from another dimension. And he had a lot of ideas which were like, I was like, wow, yes. And but by the same token, you listen to his experiences as a seminary student, okay, where he's holding down this girl that's floating. Hello, like he said, and at a it sounds like maybe the psych ward of a hospital where I'm sure, can you imagine these doctors are okay, how do I explain this? I could go into my medical books and try to describe the symptomology or psychiatry and or the DSM to try to apply some type of diagnosis, but uh the float thing, what, what do you there is no diagnosis for that. I mean, as far as what's causing this person to float. Okay. And I'm sure that's why him and the other priests were being called in because they were probably at a real loss on how to explain this. And not more than once I've heard from different sources where sometimes people would supposed mental illnesses sometimes are open channels, or that a lot of times, not all the times, some of the things that they describe that they're seeing or hearing that we attribute to being severe mental illness, they're actually really, in other words, we're not talking strictly a chemical imbalance in the brain. Maybe they're actually seeing it because for some reason they're able to see something interdimensional, or in this case, what he was saying, where you get an attachment from an entity that's parasitic. And I'm going to do a complete show on that because with some of the SRT work that I've done as a hypnotherapist, you do find that exactly what he was describing. Okay, that you do have parasites that sometimes, in it depends. In some cases, people are describing them as the parasite is the entity of a deceased person. In this case, we're talking something that's obviously negative or non-human, or in what they call dark force entities. And in some schools, some doctors have come across when they're doing this work where the entity is actually what they call an extraterrestrial, as in not a deceased human soul, not demonic per se or non-human, but extraterrestrial, as in the origins are either in another dimension or another planet, and they're using that person's body as a host either for to observe, uh, and basically they're asked to leave. It's way out there. I'm going to do another show just on that. But what he was describing, it's I've heard of this before, and I think he had the chance in those years as a seminary student. Like I said, I wasn't kidding. I'm sure that when those doctors called them in, it was like, "Hey guys, I'm going to talk to you guys. What I might not even be able to admit to my other colleagues is like, how do I explain a floating patient or people doing things like you? Maybe you're the ones that don't understand, and or at the very least, you're going to keep my confidence because I just don't know what to do with this or to handle this. Okay, yeah, we're giving maybe this person medication to address symptoms of whatever their diagnosis is of their mental illness, but she's still floating, or she's still displaying some other type of whatever. I think that is coming from somebody like him. Okay, he's had other experiences because I remember, like I said, when I was listening to some of his podcast of things that he saw when he was a seminarian that he witnessed, especially back in the 70s, where he himself described like he said when the floating refrigerator or I think it was slammed or it was moved, like that. If you think about it, it's like this can't happen. I mean, okay, there's no wires that are going to pick up a refrigerator and move it. It just doesn't happen that way. And you could tell he is he's does have up to a certain mind the mind of a skeptic, as in I'm first going to try to explain this by natural ordinary means before I go down the road of this was something supernatural in origin, whatever the origin is, who knows. But yes, and I wasn't kidding. For all the fear that might be generated, because when you realize how much we don't know versus what we do know, because remember, we think we're at the top of the food chain and whatever. Again, I'm a humanist. I believe in us human beings. I think it's exciting to realize how much we don't know. It's scary up to a point, but then it's almost like the possibilities of exploration, of discovery. Like I said, whether we're talking physical explorations, whether it's on our planet, interplanetary going to Mars, or whether we're talking interdimensional or spiritually, or how all these things bind us, how things can change by our understanding of the laws of physics. All those things, I think it's exciting. I think it's like I told him, that's when the horizon falls off the horizon. It's like, oh, that's great. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discoveries that'll happen. I hope to live a very long life, but I'm sure far beyond my lifespan. Um, I mean, let's put it this way: if you're a sci-fi writer or fantasy, there's a lot of fodder there for no matter how outlandish or how extraordinary it's you might be actually writing the future. And there was one thing that I forgot to mention, and it's really interesting as far as your perception. I can't. This was a sci-fi short story. This I read this years ago, and it was a short story for the life of me. I cannot remember the title or the author. Okay, but the story goes like this, real quick. There's a mission. Uh, Goes to a planet. I can't remember if they went there intentionally or they ended up there. Where they landed on, okay, is of extremely dangerous um, planet as far as geography. The gases that are on the planet's surface are poisonous to humans. I mean, this was like the absolute worst place for them to have landed. And I want to say, I think it was a three-person crew. And at this time, the humans had a machine that basically would transform you in other words, it would mold you in order for you to be able to go out into whatever the environment was and be adapted to it. In other words, you could be able to breathe whatever the atmosphere was, whatever the topography was. It was like almost like in Star Trek. You remember when you would get this thing where you would be able to talk and speak the language? Well, the same thing. Basically, it would enable you to acclimate immediately to go out. So they send the first person out to scout out, and this person never comes back. And they're thinking after a while, okay, what happened to this person? Second explorer says, okay, we've waited long enough. Maybe something happened to this person. Maybe despite the machinery, he didn't acclimate exactly right. Second person goes out to search for the first person, and sure enough, the second person fails to come back. So this last person's left, and he's by himself, and he kind of finds himself in a quandary. But ultimately, he makes a decision that he's gonna go into this thing and go outside and look for the other two people and find out what happened to them. Are they hurt? Do they need help? Do they need to be brought back? He doesn't want to leave them behind, but he decides he's gonna do one more trip outside. So he does it. And the punchline, it's not a punchline, it's a story, it's an actual story. What happens is when he goes outside after being basically acclimated or becoming something that can live on the surface of this place that they had landed on, was once he went outside, this place was beautiful. It was beautiful. What would have been poisonous gases to a human were wonderful. The landscape that would have looked inhospitable to a human was wonderful. To make a long story short, basically, once you went out there as the creature that actually could thrive and flourish in whatever this planet or this landscape was, you didn't want to return. You didn't want to return. So what looked to them as human beings from inside the ship as being inhospitable and a dangerous and a poisonous place, like we got to get out of here, once you went out there as a creature that belonged there, everything changed. And they hadn't come back because they were hurt. They hadn't come back because they didn't want to come back. They wanted to stay there. There we go. I got to look up that story. And I know it's a well-known, it was a short story. It was part of an anthology. And God, I can't remember. If anybody knows it, email it to me I read that a few years ago. But anyway, guys, I hope you like the show. Subscribe to my channel. Hit the like button. If you see me on YouTube, make sure, or whether you're catching me on podcast, make sure to subscribe to my channel so that you get notifications of when I release a new show. My true believers, don't forget to send me your story. Go to MiamiGhostChronicles.com. Go to the Submit Your Story tab. Okay, and we'll take it from there. We'll figure out something out, whether you want to send it to me in an email, you want to tape yourself, you want to get together and I'll interview you just like I do my guests on Skype or on Google Hangouts. Believe me, there's a thousand ways that I could get that story from you. Also, catch me on Facebook and on Twitter via Periscope, where I do a lot of live streaming. And again, I want to thank you so much for being part of my audience. You're all great, and I look forward to spending more time with you and some other super special guests that I've got coming up, which I know you guys are going to love. Take care.